The preliminary stage of Magnus Carlsen Invitational is over, and it was a thrilling competition where 8 Grandmasters did qualify to the quarterfinals, while 8 Grandmasters have been eliminated. Today I'll show you what I think is one of the best games from the preliminary stage, and that is Nepomniachtchi with the white pieces against the world champion, Magnus Carlsen. This game was played in round 8 in the second day, which was March 14th. So let's see how the game went. Nepomniachtchi had the white pieces and he went for e4. He pretty much always plays this move. Magnus responded with c5, knight f3. And his pet line, you could say, knight c6. So he's aiming for a Sveshnikov. d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, and knight f6. Brings us to the Sveshnikov after knight c3 and e5. There are several moves here, but knight db5 is the most critical move. After d6, the move knight d5 has been very popular, played by Caruana, for instance, in the World Championship match against Magnus. But bishop g5 is also very critical. a6, pushing away the knight, is the main move. Knight a3, b5. This is kind of black's point. He's taking away the c4 square for this knight, and he's also threatening to play b4 with a fork on both of these knights. So the knight usually moves to d5, or the bishop captures on f6, followed by knight d5. One of the two, in order to avoid b4. Nepomniachtchi played knight d5, bishop b7, bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, and here white can play c3 or c4. Both moves are very playable. c3 is considered to be the main move. Knight e7. The players are still in deep theory. Knight takes f6, g takes f6, knight c2. The knight wants to move on to e3, cover the square on d5, cover the square on f5, and try to play against these weaknesses here. So Magnus, he wants to get rid of these weaknesses, so he plays bishop b7, followed by d5. So now the pawn on d6 is no longer weak, while also white loses sort of the control of the d5 square. Queen e2 is played as fairly logical, protecting the pawn on e4. And here we see this funny move f5, which certainly looks quite strange. But the point is that if you take on f5, black can play e4, and now our bishop is trapped. However, black will not win a piece because I'll play f6, and now if you move the knight, I can play queen e3, and I'll have a square for my bishop. But Magnus, Jan, he went for long castles, f takes e4, and indeed, the bishop is not trapped due to this pin here. So Magnus cannot capture the bishop. Queen c7, moving out of the pin. Bishop f3. And then long castles as well. So we have a very interesting position here. Magnus's pawns in the center are sort of loose, but in return he has quite a lot of space and control of several important squares, like the d4 square and the e4 square. So it's sort of a double-edged position, but should be fairly equal. g3 from Jan. He simply wants to have the square on g2 if he needs to. King b8, king b1, knight c8. Magnus wants to maneuver his knight to b6, perhaps even jumping to c4. Maybe even considering starting an attack. Rook e1 attacking the pawn on e5. Rook e8 protecting the pawn. Knight e3. Jan is attacking the pawn on d5. And here Magnus plays knight b6, which is a move I like. He's not revealing what he wants to do. He's simply keeping the game going. Something like e4 would kind of now create a hole on d4. While playing d4 would allow Jan to take here and create a hole on e4. After something like queen takes b7 and knight f5. So I like knight b6, keeping the tension in the center. It's not really easy to tell what Jan is doing here. So he plays queen c2, a logical move, attacking the h7 pawn. f6 is a nice way to defend it, also defending the e5 pawn. Bishop g2, rook d6, rook d2. Jan decides to double on the d file, attacking the pawn on a d5. So Magnus does the same. Rook d8, rook d1, a5. Now Magnus is considering start launching an attack here on the queen side. And Jan goes for a3, which might sort of not be the best move, because he might potentially create a sort of massive weakness on b3. You should be very careful about that. I kind of like to move bishop f1 a little bit more, which means that if Magnus plays b4, I can play c4. And now Magnus should probably exchange on c4, and the game is very likely to end in a draw. Because if I play d4, I can play c5, attacking a rook and a knight, thus winning a piece. So a3 was played by Jan, knight c4 from Magnus, knight takes c4, and b takes c4, and this is exactly what I was talking about. The square on b3 is extremely weak, which means that Jan's king is slightly vulnerable here in this position. Queen f5, king a7, Magnus's king is now in a better position. Jan also improves the position of his king. Queen d7, offering a queen trade. Jan declines that queen trade. Queen c7, f4. They do not decide to repeat the moves. e4. Now Jan has... I like what Jan has been doing. Now it's not that easy for Magnus to proceed there, and he actually also needs to watch out for tricks like bishop takes c4, followed by rook takes d6. Bishop c6, rook d2, bishop e8, attacking the queen moves back, bishop c6 again, queen e3, threatening to take with a check. Therefore, the queen moves into the diagonal. f5 is played by Jan. Rook d7. It sort of looks like Jan is doing well, but it's not easy to tell how you should proceed here with white. Maybe you should try to launch a pawn storm here on the king side with g4, h4, and g5. The game continued queen h6, bishop a4, g4, king a6. They're moving back and forth here. Bishop f1 is sort of a tricky move with tactics like bishop takes c4, or even rook takes d5 followed by bishop takes c4. King moves to a7, avoiding the tactics. h4, rook b7, queen e3, rook b8, and now we notice that the evaluation bar is jumping up in favor of Jan's position, but it's not easy. It's not easy to break through. Bishop f5, takes on f6, and this was not such a great move. We notice that the bar is now going up even more, but Jan is taken on f6, which means that also his advantage diminishes as well. The better move would have been to play queen f4 with the idea of protecting this pawn, and he will simply continue the pawn storm with g6, and it looks extremely dangerous for the world champion, and indeed, objectively, this position is lost. It also looks very difficult practically too. So Jan would have been doing very well after queen f4, but instead he took on f6. Bishop takes f5 is a necessary move. Queen g5. Bishop e6 is important, protecting the pawn on d5. Bishop takes c4 was played by Jan, but it seems like this is a massive blunder. And after, if I take the bishop, I can play rook d6. And this was Jan's idea here, because now Magnus has to play queen c7, and if he does that, we will simply take the bishop. So that would have lost the game for Magnus, but Magnus has this move, rook g8, which is a very great move. Point being that after queen e5, Magnus plays rook g1, king a2, and he takes the bishop because he's threatening checkmate with queen b3. The only way to defend the checkmate is to play b4, but after c takes b3, king b2, e3, and we notice now that the bar is jumping up again. Apparently e3 is a massive mistake. I can't really see why, but it seems like a much better move would have been to simply play something like rook a1 with the idea of playing rook a2. And if you take the rook, I'll play b2 followed by bishop a2. So rook a1 would have been it for Jan, but instead Magnus played e3, allowing Jan to play this move right here. Looks sort of tricky because I'm threatening to take on a5, and Magnus would have to give away his queen. And if he plays king a6, I could then play rook d6, also winning the queen, which means that rook g2 followed by rook g1 would have been a draw. But instead, after e3, Jan takes the pawn, but after rook a1, it is impossible to prevent the threat of rook a2. Magnus has a piece up here, and he converts after rook a2 check, king b1, rook takes d2, rook takes d2, and b2, with the threat of bishop a2, which is decisive, and Jan cannot defend himself from the threat, thus he resigned. A very exciting game, going back and forth. Both players had their chances, and we have a very exciting lineup at our hands here. We have Magnus Carlsen against Levon Aronian, Jan Nepomniachtchi against Hikaru Nakamura, Wesley So against Alireza Firouzja, and Maxime Vacher-Lagrave against Anish Giri. So stay tuned for more exciting chess in the Magnus Invitational, and I'll see you soon.